Okay, here we are in After Effects, and it's time to get a little more up close and personal with some of this work here, okay? So we have this project from a student, and I think this is totally awesome work. Basically, I just wanted to kind of work on one really small part of this actually, which I thought just could be improved. It's actually a really amazing section. I just thought some of the animation was a little fast, and some of the timings could have been slowed down a little bit, and there could be a couple little pauses in there. So let's look at the section at hand first. Cool. So obviously it's a very dynamic section. My main thought here is that this rotation is really fast, and it's not really happening like on a good beat or on like a clear phrase of the music a little bit, and I think we could change that pretty easily. And then I also feel like when these pieces shoot out, they're moving too fast, especially kind of like initially, and then there's not enough of a pause before this moment happens, and then I feel like this goes a little bit off the beat too. Okay, so let's work on all that, and I will try not to take too long. But let's get in here. So this is a null object that controls the rotation of these four triangles that get kind of come together and get stuck. So let's look at this. Now, the music has a little bit of like a whang kind of a thing right around here that I think we can link this rotation to. At the moment, it's not really linked to any real sound, I don't feel like. So there's that little whang that's happening right here. I'm going to try to see if we can get this to kind of like link to that a little bit. So I would take this keyframe and move it up here. And we could try... This is pretty fast now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's about 8 frames. So let's leave that length and try to work on the interpolation a little bit. Oh, actually, before I do that, let's change the rotation. So this student has this do a full rotation here. And I hope this doesn't mess up the null object. But I think it's twice as fast as it needs to be. So I'm going to set this back down to 180. Okay, and oh nice, it's nicely set up so that didn't break anything. Cool, I don't think. Yeah, it looks good. So now let's look at the interpolation of this a little bit, right? Right now it just has like a generic ease on it, which is fine. I think it'd be a little bit stronger though if it paused a little bit at the start and then definitely had more of a big ease in at the end. Okay, so let's watch just that down. Okay, so you can start to feel how that's on the wink now. Okay, but I think it'll be clearer. So here are, let's see, we got all these pieces here. Okay, and this, okay, so here's the move out. It's, okay, these position keyframes. And, okay, so this is an extra rotation keyframe that we don't need. I'm just gonna do a little bit of housekeeping on this, clean this up a little bit to make it less confusing for myself. Okay, so here's the rotation finishes, and then right away, it's like on that frame, we're doing this big jump right off. We, meaning these triangles. Okay, so let's, and then let's hear what the beat is here. I feel the beat's coming around here. So we can actually, so let's take this and move this here so that it's really hitting the corners on the beat, okay? And let's also put some pause in here so that these aren't moving away quite so quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4, or something like that. And then let's see, yeah, that gives us exactly 10 frames for that move. So that's probably okay. Let's just look at the interpolation here of these two things. Okay. This looks like the interpolations are all over the place, so I'm just gonna hit F9 for all this and kind of tighten it back. And let's think about this for 1 second. So we want these to kind of, I think we want them to go kind of slow at the start and then hit, because we've set this up to be like a pretty big beat here. So I think these can go a little bit slower at the start, and then, let's see, they could hit kind of hard there at the end, I think, a little bit harder, right? So I think the interpolation was kind of the opposite of how I probably would have done it. And then here, this, I actually think I want this even more to pause, just like a couple more frames here. So what I'm gonna do is just copy and paste all these keyframes here, and there's nothing in here, right? Okay, this is driven by that, great, so that pause will be fine. Okay, cool, so I've got that, and then I got a pause. So let me jump back into the editor here, and now I think I just want this to be a nice sharp move here with a little bit of a a delay at the beginning and a delay at the end, but fairly symmetrical. All right, so let's check that out, starting like here. Okay, I've done something wrong because these are starting, oh, I see, they're starting here, so they just want to maybe be clipped back to here. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know if you guys are feeling that, but I really like this rotation a lot better here. I think it's a lot like sharper and smaller and just a little bit easier to look at, right? And then I think the pause here just makes this move a little bit nicer as well, a little bit more dynamic. I like that this now hits there on the beat. And let's see how, if we watch a little bit more of this down, how it feels in the middle there. Yeah, I actually think it feels more like it's hitting on the beat. Yeah, I think that improves it a little bit. I mean, I think this is a tremendous piece to begin with, but I think that those are some nice improvements to kind of just slow things down and make the actions a little bit clearer. If you think back to the very first exercise that we did with the arrow coming in and grabbing the keyframes and stuff, those kind of little pauses are so important in animation always for just directing the eye and just making the actions clear, okay? So great job on this. Let's move forward to number 2. Cool, so this student also did an amazing job on their project. I think this is really beautifully designed and really nice. So I just want to talk about like one small moment of this, which happens right at the start, which I thought could be improved a little bit. It's pretty nitpicky, and I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, I think, than the student even intended, but I do want to talk about this at the top, which is this kind of like this bounce in that happens, okay? And bouncing is a huge topic in animation, and it's a bit of a rite of passage to be able to animate a bouncing ball really well. So this is definitely something that's super challenging, okay? So let me jump in here, and what I'm gonna do is actually, let me see what's going on here. So this is my ball, and I think I'm just gonna delete out the other pieces of this, not because I think they're not amazing, but just because it'll make my life easier. And let me also see, there's a bunch of animation in here, so I just really want to do this bounce in and the stretch and squash, okay? So that looks like that ends right here. Okay, so I'm literally just going to delete all these other keyframes. So I apologize to that student because I've just completely messed up your project, right? But here we go. Here's the bounce in. And in case it's not clear, there is something going on here called stretch and squash, which is an animation principle which this student is using pretty nicely. So you can see here that the circle is elongated in the direction that it's moving here. It's called stretching, and that's to indicate that it's kind of going fast, right? And then when it hits here, you can see that it's kind of squashed down, all right? And that's to indicate that it's got this really big, like, hit, that it just hit the ground really hard, okay? So really great job for trying that out. I'm gonna actually take the stretch and squash off for the moment, and then later on, I'm gonna talk about a different way of setting that up rather than using unchanged scale. Which makes it a little bit easier. So I'm going to take that off, okay? So this is now circular shaped, okay? And so here's the animation right now. And I think what you could tell from this right away is that the ball doesn't bounce up very high, and then the timings are a little bit strange on that. So let's just talk again for a second about bouncing. We talked about this in Explainly, but really quickly, and that was in a long video. So each time a ball bounces, it loses energy when it hits the ground, okay? And that means that over time, it eventually comes to a stop, right? Something to do with gravity, I guess. Again, science is not my thing. But what this essentially means in practice is the bounce, and I'm talking about a normal ball here, okay? So not like a golf ball or not like a bowling ball, but more like a rubber ball that's about this big that's got a sort of generic amount of bounce to it. Okay, so it's not going to bounce like a billion times like a golf ball, or like one time like a bowling ball, which is really heavy. So this is a kind of in-between material and weight ball, sort of like a vanilla bounce. Okay, so in that situation, what happens is that the ball, when it bounces back up, if it starts from up here, it should bounce back up to about half that height, okay? And then for each successive bounce after that, it should jump back up about half that height, and in a certain amount of frames less over time, because, you know, as I said before in the Explainly video, the rhythm of a bouncing ball is more like bounce, 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 right? It gets faster, the timing of the keyframes gets faster toward the end, and the amount that it bounces back up each time gets a little bit smaller, okay? So with that in mind, let's remake this a little bit. So first of all, I think, with the stretch on, this ball was not even fully outside the screen, and I think it's probably a good idea with a bounce to just sort of move this up a little bit more at the start. Oh, and the other thing that I want to do is get in here and separate the dimensions, okay? Because this is only going to bounce on the y-axis, so it'll make it easier, and then we can work in our value graph rather than the speed graph, and bouncing is way easier in the value graph, all right? So, okay, so we got that going, we've separated this out, and now let's look at these keyframe timings a little. So the bounce in takes 10 frames. So the next bounce, which is going to be up and down, should also be 10 frames, okay? And just take my word on that. And then let's now start the diminishment. So if it was 10 frames, let's do the next bounce, both up and down, to equal 7 frames. Okay, so it's gone from 10 to 7, so it's getting a little bit smaller. And now the next keyframe, let's move like 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 5 frames, and we'll copy and paste that. Let me go 1, 2, 3, and I'll copy and paste that, and I'll go 1, 2, and I'll copy and paste that. Now, all I've done is determined a shortening series of keyframe timings, and I haven't really made any animation here because the only animation going on is somehow here, and I don't even really want that to happen. Copy, paste, yeah, okay. I see, I've pasted the wrong value in here. Whoops, so let me just quickly do that. All right, so, or maybe I didn't, I'm not quite sure. Actually, I probably made a mistake there, so I'm just gonna drop this guide here. This is our new floor, okay? So right now, again, the animation just drops in, it hangs out there, okay? I've just set up the timings. Now I'm gonna add some ease onto this by pressing F9. Right now, we have this dropping in, and so when things fall, they don't know that the ground is coming up, so they don't get slower when they hit the ground. They're essentially like going faster and faster until they hit the ground, and then they're bouncing back up really quickly. And unless it's like made out of like, I don't know, some sort of like morphing foam that hangs out on the ground. If it's like a ball, it's going to bounce up quickly. So the way we would animate this is to take this, I'm going to hold down an option, maybe I'll get a little closer here. This is the bounce down. So I'm going to move this like this, which is to say that it's getting faster and faster, and then when it hits really hard, okay? And then when it bounces back up, it also bounces up really hard. So without any pause in here, okay? And here we go. This is the really fun part, and this is, I'm going to hold option again, is basically you're going to describe the height at which this bounces up using these curves. So like we said, this should bounce up about halfway as high as it bounced, which we can assume is around the top of the frame somewhere. So that could bounce up to about there, right? And so now it like bounces in like that, right? Which is really what we want. And then let me quickly just show that you can kind of do the exact same thing now for all these other ones and have the bounce height here, this height, this arc, get a little bit smaller on each bounce up. Okay, until we get down to the end here, and then this last one is just like this really slight little bounce, okay, just like a little thing like that. And you do want to try to keep these handles basically as symmetrical as you can make them, kind of right and left here. And again, this is something that Joey goes into a lot in Animation Boot Camp, so if this doesn't make sense to you, I would definitely recommend taking that. And what you want to do now is just make sure that this is a nice curve from this peak to this peak to this peak to this peak, which looks like I'm a little bit off. I think this needs to, maybe this needs to bounce up a little bit higher here. And maybe this also a little bit higher. Anyway, you'll get used to the way this should look. So let's check this out and just see what that looks like before I fiddle too much. Right? It's a nice, even bounce, and the timings feel good, and the way that it diminishes feels pretty good, okay? So, again, I went over that really quickly, but basically you want a curve sort of like this, and you don't have to animate keyframes for these up points if you do it this way, which is the advantage. You could also put keyframes up there, but essentially you'd be kind of creating these same curves again, all right? So that's sort of like an intro to ball bouncing. And now I also did want to talk about stretch and squash a little bit, okay? And this is going to be also, I think, a little bit advanced, but that's what this is for. So the way that this student did this was to create a stretch and squash situation by this unchained scale. And that's a great method, but I want to show you a slightly better method that I think is easier to work with. It involves an expression, but the main thing about that you're not going to get this way, the way this student did it, is you'll keep the volume of the circle the same, okay? So that is it's like if it stretches 10% in this direction, it needs to shrink that same 10% in the other direction to keep the volume of the circle consistent, all right? A little bit of geometry math for you here. The way I'm going to set this up, okay, is I'm going to take my ball layer here, and I'm going to put an expression control on this, which is a slider, okay? And this just now gives you this, oops, didn't mean to make a keyframe, this kind of generic slider, the kind of which you'd see in After Effects in lots of different ways, okay? And you can control this and link things to this, which is what we're gonna do. And I'm gonna call this my stretch and squash, like that, except for spelled correctly, right? And now the other thing I wanna do with this is I want to right click on this value and go to edit value, okay, and that opens this slider, and I want to change the range from -100 to 100. And all that means there is now 0 is at the middle, okay, which I think is going to make things a little bit easier. And if you ever want to go back to the fully circular circle, you just set it back to 0, so that's easier, okay? Now we got to do some work with expressions here, and it has to do with scale. And anytime you do an expression with scale, you always have to return a value in two values, actually, an X and a Y value, okay? Unless it's in 3D space, and then I think you need 3 values, but whatever. So the end of this expression always has to be bracket and then an X value, comma, and a Y value closed bracket, all right? Like this, right? So that it will make sense to After Effects to put a value back in this kind of format, okay? So follow along with me here for 1 sec. So I'm going to stretch this out a little, if I can get that handle there. So tiny. Okay, stretching this out. Now I'm going to type, first I'm going to define what my X value is. And I'm going to type xval equals, and that's just, I just made this up, okay? It's just a word for myself, xval just meaning the X value, okay? I'm defining a variable. So I'm going to say xval equals, and now I'm going to take this little pick whip here, and I'm going to pick whip to the X value of the scale, okay? Not to the word scale, which will take both, or to the Y value here, but to the X. And you can see how there's like a little box around that now. So I'm going to let go of that, and it's going to say X equals transform.scale, and then it's going to have that 0 in there in brackets, which, believe it or not, refers to the X. Don't worry about this so much. Just basically redo what I'm doing here if you ever want to do this, okay? Plus, okay? And then I'm going to take the pick whip again and move it over here to the slider value, okay? So it's this value, which happens to be 60 right now, plus 0, which is 60. And I'm going to put a semicolon in there, which means I'm going to go down to the next line, okay? And then I'm going to define my Y val equals, again, I'm going to pick whip to this one now, the Y side of this, not the X, but the Y, okay? Now you see that as a 1 there instead of a 0. And now I'm going to say minus, and that's really important that you put a minus there because there's a plus on this one and there's a minus on this one, and now I'm going to link again to this slider value, okay? And put another semicolon there. So now I've defined what my X and my Y values are, and now all I have to do, like I was mentioning earlier, is bracket and then xval, comma, yval, right? And then closed bracket. And I could even put some spaces in there to make that make some more sense. Okay, and that won't affect things at all. So I just need a bracket, and then I need a number here, which I've defined this way, and then a comma, and then another number, which I've defined this way, and then another bracket, okay? And I'm gonna click out of this, and what you'll see is nothing has changed, because right now, this value is set to 0, so these are still at 60, because it's just adding and subtracting 60 from that value. From these values, okay? So right now, nothing's changed. But if I go up here and I change my slider value, you'll see that now this has gone to 43, and this has gone to 77. The same amount, which is 17, has been added to one and subtracted to the other, okay? Which means, again, that there's volumetric symmetry here, right? So I can stretch this like this, and squash this and stretch this like this, right? And now it should stay perfect. And you only need to animate it with this one value unlike once you start separating these and animating these separately. So this is like a much easier thing to now adjust in the value graph, okay? So that's my little stretch and squash rig. I mean, I think, the way you'd put that into action would obviously take me a long time, but I would have this as it's moving down. This is a common error that you see, and which the student did actually, which was to have it stretched as it's moving down like this. And maybe a keyframe here, and then to go to this point and squash it like this, right? And then I would need to actually drop this down a little bit to make that actually land on the ground or whatever. But this is actually a common error, which is that, again, the ball doesn't know that it's going to hit the ground, so it wouldn't start squashing until it hits right there. So this would actually be much more like a hold keyframe animation right there at the beginning, right? Like this. Now, I've exaggerated that a lot, obviously, to make the point, but that's sort of how that would work. And then here, actually, this you don't want to be a hold keyframe. As it goes back up again, you would want this to go back to being 0 with some sort of ease on this, right? And that's probably too fast, but it would be something like that, right? Okay, so I'm not going to sit here and animate all this stretch and squash. I just wanted to show how to animate a ball bounce a little bit better and how to make this stretch and squash rig for you to play around with yourselves. And finally, we've come to the third project that I'm going to look at. And this student also did a really nice job, and they kind of brought this little intro animation to their project, and I just want to show this right now. I think the rhythm of this is really nice to the music, so I just want to play this down. Right? Cool. So the bounces are really fun, and like I said, I think he really nailed the rhythm of this. That's not necessarily what I'm going to talk about, but I did want to point out the way that the student did this, and I think as nice as I think of a job as they did, I think it's kind of a less than ideal way to do this animation. And if you look here, you'll see that this student has split this sort of main character here, this green ball, the main character of the shot, into a bunch of different layers. I assume maybe they used split layer or something. So it's sort of like for each little piece of this animation, they've got just, this piece of a layer doing that. And I think that is actually, I can understand why the student did that. I think to sort of break it down and make it maybe a little bit easier just to make all the adjustments. But in this case, I think what would happen is if you needed to change something about your ball, like the way it moves in the first one, you'd then have to get into each one of these layers and start adjusting this position to like line it all back up again, which is, a lot more difficult than if you had just animated this all on one layer. And I assume that like when I dig into this a little bit, I see that like there's some like overlapping position right here, and this is a tricky move. I think what this what the student was going for in this moment is like the ball kind of like rolls over and it's like losing speed the whole time, and it gets to the end of the little shelf, and it is just enough speed to kind of like take it over and down to the next shelf, which is a really fun idea for beginning. And I think that, probably the reason these layers are all split up is because of that, though I'm not really sure. This is a definitely disadvantageous way to animate in After Effects, okay? Much more what I'd rather see you doing is just have one layer, for all of this ball action and just pretty much animate it on that one layer. And if things get like super confusing and locked up, I guess you could split it. But it does really make it harder to adjust things before and after if you have to constantly spread those adjustments out across like 10 different layers or whatever. So I generally think that that's probably an easier way to go. So I would definitely animate it all just on this one layer and turn off all this other stuff, which is totally going to like mess up your project right now. But maybe we can look at just the beginning of this. And let me also, I guess, turn this off. So let's see. We've got... Let's see. What's the first thing that happens is this. Okay, the ramp. Okay, so this is coming in, right? And that's my blue. And I see. Okay, this just here only has linear keyframes, and the ball has an ease on it. So right away I'm like, all right, I think we could probably make that a little bit stronger by just like considering how we want all this to move and then adding the right eases in. So here at the beginning, I feel like, let me turn this audio off. I feel like at the beginning, it wants to kind of like, the blue needs to establish itself right away, because otherwise there's like nothing on screen here. So if I made these E's, what I'd think I'd be interested in doing with this is, I'm just going to link the scale so I can adjust these all together, is putting some delay on the start. No, actually, the opposite. Having the start move faster because it's the only thing on screen, and then putting some delay on at the end so that we can watch it and kind of understand it as it slows down. Right? So it's just a little bit more like fluid right away. And also the ball needs to kind of like follow after it rather than kind of happening at the same time. So I would also delay some of the ball coming on. And let's see, I would also, I'm going to put some generic E's on those. And so the ball also, it can start out moving quickly and then get slower and slower and slower, because I think that's what the animator is looking for here, is for it to kind of slow down to the end and finally just sort of like fall over the edge. Right, so I think that's like a little bit more dynamic right from the start. It's just to have the two things both easing in at the end, but in slightly different rates, but definitely to have an ease going on there, okay? And then, little things like, so when this student animated the first ball to bounce down, there's kind of like this weird arc on it a little bit. I feel like if it's really slowing down, it should fall almost straight down. So, that would involve probably taking this, and I guess that's this layer here, and that moves across and scales up. That's kind of a cool animation. I just think I want this to be, more underneath the ball here so that it can just kind of like fall onto that. And let's see. Let's look at this again. That animation. Okay, well, obviously I need to turn this off. And so, what's interesting here is with this, we've got a lot of animation here for like a second and a half before we can even see this, right? So maybe, either you could set another position keyframe right there, and the animation could be, more like this, these two things, and get rid of this, so that it's moving less over. You can make that faster, obviously, but at least then, the animation's kind of happening all at the same time. So I might try to do something like that, and maybe just have this kind of like, I think it'd be more fun if, like, right before the ball starts to fall down, this just kind of like slides in and catches it at the last second kind of a thing. So I'd probably have this move sort of, let me chain this, move this pretty, slow in and slow out, and really exaggerate the, actually, no, maybe that's the wrong way. Maybe I want this to go a little bit more suddenly, like I said. So maybe like that. Now it's too late, obviously. But maybe have this happening and landing around here, so that the ball can just kind of dribble over. And now for that ball dribble, now this is going to be tough. And I'm going to delay this movement off just so I can look at it. Okay, so the ball rolls in, and it's kind of coming right to the end here, right? And then the trick is like how to get this to just like fall down really nicely onto this next shelf. So, again, this is a tricky animation. I think maybe pretty quickly is part of the answer here. And I guess this does need to have maybe a tiny little arc on it, just so it can kind of clear this corner. Let's see. Yeah, because we don't want it to like move through the shelf there. So maybe we could even have this roll farther over at the start. Yep. So it like really gets to the end. It's almost like a Wile E. Coyote move there. It's kind of like hanging on for dear life with one toe. And then when this drops, yeah, I guess we do need a little arc on that. Oops, not that big. Let me drag this. Let me just with this one, drag this, put this back to the center, and now really just try to figure out a way to have this minimally arc, but clear the end of that. Yeah, that might be too much. But let's see now. So I can view that and watch that down. And obviously it's too fast on the fall. So we might have to space that out a little bit better. Yeah, and now it eases too much into the fall. Okay, so let's work on this. So when it gets down here, it's slowing down quite a bit, right? And then maybe we don't want it to reach exactly coming to a stop, which is what it means to be at the very bottom of this. So maybe we could move this up just a little bit so it doesn't ever come to a stop. And then what we could do is we could actually, there's this button here to make auto orient keyframe, which is the kind of circular one where it just kind of flows it as best as possible from one to the next. So that actually moved that up and this down, which is pretty awkward. It's not at all what we want, so maybe that's no good. We need this to be moving fast at the start and getting slower and slower like we had it before, right? Like that. Oh, this is looking really bad. So I'm going to undo all that, and maybe auto orient is not the way to go there. That kind of messed us up. So instead, let's just do this kind of a quick, I guess the pause can be here, but then this should be really quick as it falls down, like so, and maybe even like fewer frames. So let's watch that. Even quicker, I think. That's probably the right idea. Yeah. Okay, cool. And obviously you could put like a little bounce on it or whatever, but that's, I think that's what the student was going for a little bit more, and that's really super tricky. Like that would, to get this just right, that would definitely take me a whole bunch of work to make that happen. All right, so yeah, so good job here on that, and that takes us to the end of this episode of Animation Oatmeal. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope this made sense.